Hi, Donald here with Floating Feathers Kayak Fly Fishing School with another tips and tricks. And this tips and tricks is how to do your fly casting, or how to learn fly casting from the seated position. Often as kayak fly anglers, we're going to be sitting to do our fly casting. Now, yes, you can stand, and depending on your abilities and the capabilities of kayak, you may be able to stand in that kayak and fly fish. But that's not always the case. It depends on the situation, the waters I'm in, and everything else. Sometimes, probably half the time, or most of the time, I'm actually sitting down and I'm casting. Some little tips on what it means, or what to look for, how to practice fly casting when in a seated position. So, if you think of sitting in a kayak as being very similar to when you're wading in waist-deep water. Okay, what I mean by that is you really can't move your hips too much, right? I mean, you can move your hips a little, right? And you can't move your feet or legs that much either when in hip deep water, because if you're wading, you're trying to fight, you've got to keep your feet planted, right? So that the water doesn't move you and you're casting. Okay, sitting is pretty much the same thing. You can have a little bit of hip rotation, right? Because you're sitting down, you can still move your hips and your lower back a little bit, but you're not able to move your legs. So if you think of the motion of your body, that is the same or very extremely similar to when you're wading in waist-deep water. One of the things, the biggest things you can do is practice, like take your seat out of your kayak. If your kayak has a removable seat like this, take it out of your kayak, sit it on the lawn, and practice casting from it. It's a huge benefit. If your kayak does not have a removable seat, you can simply sit in the grass and practice casting that way. Okay, that's going to give you an idea of the limits and limitations that your body has when casting from a seated position. All right. Some of the techniques that you can use, the casting techniques that you can use. Yes, you can use an overhead cast or backhand cast or whatever you want to call that, right? Traditional casting works fine. You can even roll cast. I have on occasion even two-handed spade cast from a fly rod, from a kayak. It's not something that you just start doing. You have to build yourself up to some of those. But you can roll cast. You can do all the casts that you can from a standing position. When in a seated position, it just takes practice. So the top three that I really recommend, top four. So the one is traditional backhand or overhead cast, right? That's going to work fairly well for most situations, all right? The next one is if you want to modify that a little bit. So instead of you're coming here with your fly rod, if you want to high stick that a little bit, if you want to come back, right, and then come forward. Because you come back, you're going to keep that fly line on your back cast off of the water behind you, okay? So you can high stick your cast a little bit, and that will actually help keep your fly line off the water because you're so close to the water, okay? Another technique is sidearm casting, or side casting, right? If you can get that, now of course you're going to have to build your line speed up, but sidearm casting works really well in a kayak in a seated position because you're not using a whole lot of your lower body, but you're using a pretty good amount of your upper body. So in a seated position, sidearm casting works extremely well. And the last one that I recommend you learning, if you don't know how to do that, is a Belgian cast. A Belgian cast is kind of a unique combination of a few things, but in a kayak, it works extremely well if you can learn how to do that Belgian cast. Now, it's going to take some practice if you don't know how, but please, Google it, YouTube it, figure out how to do a Belgian cast, and try that from in the lawn, or try that standing first. Practice that Belgian cast, and then practice it from the kayak, and I think that you'll find that Belgian cast or the sidearm cast is probably the two that you're going to favor the most, one of those two. I happen to favor the sidearm cast in most situations, unless the environment doesn't allow me to do so, and then I'll try a Belgian cast or sometimes a roll cast. So that is my tips and tricks for learning to fly cast from a seated position in a kayak. Remember, it's very similar to wading. I practice sitting in your kayak seat or just sitting on the lawn and practice your fly rod there. Your high sticking or a regular backhand or overhead cast will work. Learn to sidearm cast and learn to Belgian cast. So that is my tips and tricks for you from me, Donald, right here at the Floating Feathers Kayak Fly Fishing School YouTube channel. Please tune in every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Central, where I will have tips on kayaking, fly fishing, and kayak fly fishing. Until next time, tight lines and safe paddles.